The first time I saw the original Kong was in New Zealand on TV, a Friday night, and I would have been about 8 or 9 years old, probably about 1970. It was King Kong that actually started my love of fantasy and science fiction. So before that, even though I'd been making little Super 8 movies, they were mainly World War II films, and Kong was one of those defining moments in your life where everything changed after I saw Kong. For starters, it gave me a real sense of what I wanted to do as a career, which wasn't actually to become a director, it was to become a special effects person, because what King Kong does, I think, if you're of the right frame of mind, is it totally inspires you to think about the trickery of films. It's the wonderful escapist use of special effects. And so after seeing King Kong, I started to experiment with stop motion. I made little puppets. I used to animate them with my parents' Super 8 camera. And I was, I just didn't really know anything about it particularly. But within maybe 3 or 4 years, I found Famous Monsters of Filmland, which is Forry Ackerman's magazine. Hugely inspirational. On every page it had photos of monsters, and sometimes you got the absolute motherlode, which was the behind-the-scenes photographs of Willis O'Brien or Ray Harryhausen at work. I mean, they were the photos that I used to crave for, the ones showing the guys actually bending over the table animating, because they were the little glimpse behind the curtain of how this stuff was done. Ray Harryhausen obviously became an influence too, because if you start getting interested in Kong and stop motion, you gradually learn about Ray Harryhausen, and I learned about his movies. Seventh Voyage of Sinbad was re-released in the early 1970s, and I got to see Seventh Voyage at the cinema in colour, which was great, because our TVs were just black and white in those days, which was fine for Kong, not so good for Sinbad. I think the solitary nature of the stop-motion animator, which was part of the mystique of O'Brien or Harryhausen, was that they would disappear into their garage all by themselves and produce these magical sequences. I think that appealed to me too. The fact that I wasn't going to be, dealing with 200 people. I was just going to be able to do it all by myself. But it explains why my movies have a lot of special effects in them. I mean, I am a frustrated special effects guy, basically. When I was about 12, 2 or 3 years after I saw Kong, I decided I was going to do a remake of it. In my burst of excitement, I made a little puppet, stop-motion puppet of Kong with wire, joints. I decided I was going to start, the first sequence I was going to really have a go at doing was the Empire State Building. So I built the top of the Empire State Building out of cardboard. See, I didn't even bother painting the back of it, because I thought we'd only be filming it from the front, so I conserved your resources. Yeah, I conserved my silver paint, must have been in short supply. I got my mother to give me an old sheet that I stretched it on the wall. I pinned it up onto my bedroom wall and stretched it, and I painted the cyclorama of a volcano in a sort of Skull Island prehistoric kind of world to go behind the dinosaurs. And I never got around to building an aeroplane, actually, for attacking Kong. I got the Empire State Building, then I got Kong. I did some little bit of test shooting of him moving around. I got so far and just realised it was never going to be what I was imagining it to be in my mind. And so I gave up on it eventually and moved on to other things. I mean, I still kept doing stop motion though. I did a thing for a school filmmaking competition when I was about 15 or 16 that had a Cyclops monster in it, or sort of something that looked like Harryhausen's Cyclops. One eye and a horn. It was very much like Ray's Cyclops. So I certainly kept on doing stop motion, but I never really got any further with my remake of Kong, unfortunately. While we were making The Frighteners, we were working with Universal on that particular movie, and we had a call from our executive on The Frighteners, Lenny Kornberg. I think they were seeing dailies of The Frighteners and they were liking what they were seeing. And Lenny called us and said, there's a couple of horror movies that the studio is wanting to remake, and would either of them interest me? And one was The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I sort of didn't get too excited about, and the other one was King Kong, which I did get very excited about. And I said to Lenny, because I'd never mentioned Kong to him at all, and I said, you realise this is my favourite film? And he said, oh, really? And it was interesting because I was also aware that Universal in years earlier had attempted to remake King Kong in 1975. when Dino De Laurentiis was doing his version for Paramount, I think it was, Universal were developing a competing version of Kong. So I was reading about that. I remember looking in one of the very first issues of Starlog magazine I ever bought, and they had an article about the competing Kongs in 1975. And so it was weird to be talking to somebody at Universal and basically to being offered to now pick up the reins and do what Universal had failed to do 20 years earlier. And so I was excited. We had to get The Frighteners finished first, which we did.
We're all about to go on a big holiday and, and just sort of, relax after The Frighteners. And so Pete sort of, obviously had another project in the wings and let us all know. So, we were all coming back to work on that.
Everybody in the facility sat down and we all read the script. A fun script, but different in tone. A little bit more sort of smart and a little bit more kind of jokey.
It was sort of flippant, very Hollywood, it had the sort of same tone as The Mummy, I guess.
When I saw The Mummy, I thought, did they read the King Kong script? It was almost that sort of, classic sort of Hollywood adventure feeling kind of film.
I remember initially the first time we come across Jack, he's a World War I fighter pilot, and he and his buddy are up in their biplanes doing baseball practice, chucking a ball and hitting it back to each other while they're flying along.
I think the Red Baron turned up at one stage.
So I got to do a sort of a World War I dogfight sequence, which I'd put in there because I'd always wanted to do a World War I dogfight scene, still do.
And was, sort of upper class English kind of, character. She was the daughter of a lord who was a boffiny archaeologist type.
They were on a dig in Sumatra.
And that's how they sort of are introduced to the concept of this ape god and this ancient sort of civilization. And then, Carl Denham's there trying to make a movie.
We imagined him to be much more stern and more of a overt villain. There were elements of our 1996 script that survived. The Brontosaurus stampede was pretty much exactly as written in 1996. The Tyrannosaurus Rex fight with the 3 T-Rexes was again something that we had planned for the 1996 version. The sequence in New York with the Empire State Building at the end was there, but it was somewhat different because we had Jack Driscoll basically commandeering an old aeroplane and taking off and flying around the Empire State Building to try to protect Kong, and we had the other naval planes attacking him and Jack Driscoll in his plane trying to get in their way and trying to block them and trying to sort of throw them off their aim, and he was sort of flying around as well.
It kind of took the essence of Kong and reimagined it. Lots of different extra story points and different characterizations.
During that period of time, we did a lot of pre-production artwork. Richard Taylor and his gang at Weta Workshop did a lot of maquettes for dinosaurs, for Kong. We did many, drawings.
Because our design department was all very green and, very young, boundless enthusiasm, but not a lot of experience, Bernie Wrightson was brought on board.
Bernie's a great comic book artist and is a superb visual storyteller with the way that he draws, and so I thought that Bernie's style would be really interesting to mesh Kong and Bernie Wrightson together.
Our design team started a huge round of conceptual art, first through illustration and then through 3D sculptural marketing.
We were basically all just having a go at the different dinosaurs. So yeah, I was having a go at everything, really. There was pet creatures, there was dinosaurs, and Kong himself. But it was sort of evened out at that stage. Everyone sort of had a go at everything.
We designed a very classic, very Harryhausen-esque brontosaur. Similar to the one that Ray had done for 1 million years BC. I always thought it was actually, quite a similar looking brontosaur, a very, very classic design.
Kong was a funny one because I don't think we really, in the 96 version, resolved Kong. We were getting close, and we definitely went down some really strange avenues, some really interesting looks that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of.
What he was back then was a gorilla in his prime, this giant, majestic beast. There was a little bit of scarification and that sort of thing, but he essentially was this really majestic creature.
At that point, we had still perceived that we would have to do Kong with animatronic components.
We were going to do the classic Kong's mechanical hand like they have done in the previous versions, and I know that Weta Workshop had got pretty far advanced with designing and building a mechanical hand rig. We also had a sequence with some crocodiles that attacked a sinking car at one stage, and we were going to be building mechanical animatronic crocodiles that were going to be sort of busting in the windows of the slowly sinking vehicle.
But probably the largest body of work that we started was in 1996. Animatics created digitally were not a reality at this point, or they certainly weren't in our scope of work. So the only way that we could think to pre-visualize the movie in filmic images was to do it with stop animation. Can you imagine? So we set about and in fact made all of the creatures as stop animation armatures. We made 8 brontosaurs, we made the T-Rexes, we made the Carnosaurs, the Raptors, we made all the sailors, all with stop animation armatures. We sculpted them, fiberglass molded them and ran them in foam. When we had all the brontosaurs lined up, it was quite a spectacular array of critters.
I also thought there was something nice about prevising in stop motion, even though the movie was going to be completely computer generated, that it gave us a first pass in the old-fashioned technique. So we'd sort of somehow, that flavour would be inherited by the finished film itself.
About half the people who were working on the show at Digital at that time were working on the digital build of 1933 period New York. And that turned out to be really useful, because when we kicked off with King Kong in 2003, when we got back onto that project, the first thing we did was we unloaded that low-resolution New York dataset, and that became our previs environment for pre-visualizing all the New York scenes in King Kong. So what was going to be a hero asset in 1996, 97 became a previs asset for the 2003 version, which I think indicates the degree to which the complexity of the work that we were doing had progressed over the years.
We had tools, don't get me wrong, but they certainly weren't as intuitive as what we're doing now. Back then it was researching looks, doing the modeling of the biplanes themselves, animation tests, environment tests, crash tests, that kind of thing. There was one dogfight test that we did that put these planes in downtown Wellington. It was like a helicopter fly-past shot, and you've got these planes just going at it, burning, catching on fire, shooting buildings, bombs are going off. Good stuff.
Being able to take a digital plane and crash it into the ground and have that look believable was a very complex task that we really had to do a big R&D project on.
This is actually in the days before like pixel tracking or motion tracking or even something like Shake. So all of our matching the buildings happened very laboriously. It was a more painful world doing visual effects in those days.
We never got anywhere close to developing a final Kong puppet or a final CG design. By January 97, which was about 6 or 7 months after we'd gotten underway, we had the plug pulled on us suddenly.
As I understand it, which I think is, as everyone else understands it, Universal got cold feet because there was Godzilla and Mighty Joe Young due to come out that year. It's another movie about a big gorilla and another movie about a monster terrorizing New York City.
So Universal were looking at being the 3rd place out of 3 monster movies. And so in the beginning of 97, it just started to feel wrong. And within a few weeks, it just spiraled downhill and was sort of over and done. Blink, finished, bang.
I remember Charlie McClellan, the visual effects producer, he'd obviously got the call, he sort of came in and he had the schedule all up on the board, and he just grabbed the schedule and just ripped it off.
Yeah, we kind of, went round to one of our colleagues' place and drowned our sorrows a little bit and tried to put a brave face on it.
Yeah, there were tears. Some people were really quite upset.
People had become very emotionally involved. For many of us, it was our first big film project, and so we invested ourselves completely in it.
Back then we had sculpted this wonderful maquette of Kong fighting these 3 dinosaurs, this really big model that we gave as a gift to the studio. It was like one of my trips to LA to have a script meeting. I took this big model. I lugged this thing across in a carton and assembled it in the hotel in LA, and then took it to Universal and presented it to them as a thank you at one of our meetings. And then when they killed the movie, I called them up and said, "Send me my model back." And we got it back, and it's a model that's been sitting in the lobby of Weta Workshop for the last 8 or 9 years. And everybody that came to the workshop would go, "Oh, wow, look at this." And it was always a slightly bittersweet feeling, because I look at it and it was always represented the film that didn't happen, so I was really pleased to finally be able to get that T-Rex fight out of my system, because that one had certainly been stuck in my head for quite a long time.
What happened when we first just when King Kong got canned, is that Pete immediately asked us to start doing some design work for The Hobbit.
Something was up. We didn't know what exactly, but it then changed to Lord of the Rings, which then was suddenly like, okay, how do we do this?
And so I actually started storyboarding The Lord of the Rings in August 1997.
And we all know what happened next.
It's arguable that Lord of the Rings would ever have been made if we had made Kong, and but more importantly, we weren't equipped to make it. Back then, we didn't have the experiences that we had garnered off Lord of the Rings, nor did we have the computer power and sophistication that we have today.
Weta managed to develop its skills quite a lot during the course of making The Lord of the Rings, and it prepared itself for the monster that was Kong.
And hindsight's a wonderful thing. We just learnt so much from the Lord of the Rings experience that we were able to bring back into Kong.
I think things always happen for a reason, so I think it was possibly a good thing that nothing happened. I think it would have been a different film then. I don't think it would have been as emotive, and I don't think that the story would have evolved as much as it did.
But for me, it was always unfinished business. It was a dream that I'd wanted since I was a kid that had been unfulfilled in a way that wasn't particularly pleasant back in 1996. And I'd always feel a little pang of disappointment that that was the film that I wish I could have made that I never did get made. It was strange during Lord of the Rings because Weta Workshop had all of our Kong models from 1996, and they were all up on a shelf in the sculpting room. And so all the way through Lord of the Rings for like 6 or 7 years, I'd go in for numerous meetings into the sculpting room, and I'd always step in the door and be reminded of Kong. So I did spend 6 or 7 years being kind of tormented and tortured by looking at all these things of the film that never happened.
And, you know, I mean, in all honesty, I thought Kong would never get made, and Pete was just adamant, we're going to do it one day. You know, there was never a day, you know, that you know, he even sort of considered that we were never going to do it.
So it was really nice when we got a phone call from Universal asking us if we were interested in revisiting King Kong. That phone call happened while we were on Two Towers.